Over the months, I've gotten an increasing love for the horror genre, especially when it comes to film. Whether it's thrilling, gritty, or campy, there's a joy I get from sitting down with scary media that I just cannot stop chasing. However, the subgenre of horror that I've gravitated towards strongly is one that is thoughtful with its spooks. Arthouse horror is where I've found the most enjoyment. It's horror that's enticing because of how it uses narrative and atmosphere to create ideas that slowly burrow into you and frighten you the more you think about it. However, when I look at horror games, it's a different story. As much as I love playing horror games, there's very few that give me the same enjoyment of film like Inland Empire would. Examples of artistic uses of horror can be found, of course, but in recent memory, there hasn't been anything substantially out of the box. So it really begs the question, can Arthouse horror take form as a video game? To the uninitiated, you may be asking, what is Arthouse horror? Well, I am by no means a film connoisseur, so like any other weirdo, I shall use Wikipedia as a frame of reference. Arthouse horror is defined as a subgenre of both horror films and art films. It explores and experiments with the artistic uses of horror. Some characteristics of Arthouse horror include a reliance on atmosphere building, psychological character development, cinematic style, and philosophical themes for effect rather than straightforward scares. This subgenre to me is horror at its finest. Sure, elements of Arthouse can be found in other styles of horror, but Arthouse horror feels like a combination of these listed elements put together in a way that makes for a fulfilling experience, giving you more to think about outside of the film. When moviegoers typically see horror films in the cinema, it's given the same enthusiasm as a roller coaster ride, an experience full of spooks and scares that you come away from and say, that was fun, and then move on with your life. And you can kind of see that mentality being reflected in what horror films are popular. This isn't to say it's a bad way to approach the genre, just more of an acute observation. But it leaves room for wanting more, and Arthouse horror fills in those blanks. A movie like Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Pulse is an example of thoughtful horror that's hard to beat with how engaging it is. Whether it can be classified as Arthouse is in the eye of the beholder, but what can't be denied is how compelling it is. The film's plot is anchored around spirits using the internet to invade the living world, haunting various people in the process. At its core, Pulse is a film about the effects of isolation in a digital age, and its horror comes from the realization of that concept. It's a brilliant film that I've enjoyed more and more through repeated watchings, and as much as I'd love to analyze it, I'm not a film essayist, so I'm instead gonna wrap my tangent up and talk about some horror games. Oddly enough, I think both horror films and games are in parallel, at least when it comes to notable releases. It's worth bringing this discussion up because in order to understand the lack of artistic horror games, we need to understand the market. And the market determines that horror is a niche when compared to other genres. And there's plenty of good reasons as to why. Being scared is something that most people won't find enjoyable after all. With games specifically, it feels like horror is susceptible to triteness, where one game creates a style of gameplay and others, big and small, follow suit. In terms of mainstream recognition, horror doesn't have much of a presence. There's the occasional spark of interest for a new release, but it's few and far between. The only horror game I can remember from 2021 that had huge buzz around it was Resident Evil Village, and that game is from a long-standing franchise. Thus, that brings us to Arthouse horror in video games. From what I've discussed so far, I make it seem like there isn't anything artistic in horror games, but that isn't exactly the case. In fact, you may even find good examples of games you could consider Arthouse horror. My purpose is to highlight a selection of games that I think best reflect Arthouse horror from a film perspective. Based on that, I want to discuss 3 titles that best highlight this. 3 games with thoughtful uses of horror that linger in your mind, leaving such a strong impression that I feel they deserve to be highlighted with a very bright spotlight. Speaking of spotlights, what better place to start than the theatre of the space between? Created by Christoph Frey, the space between oozes an art house, from its atmosphere to its methodically slow pacing. It's a game with a surrealist open-ended narrative based around the topic of relationships and their complexities. It's a game about closeness and distance, in which you play as Martin Melanson, an architect who was commissioned to create the Bright Hall Theatre. We relive the final few days before his death in this theatre, where he meets a woman named Clara whom he grows close to. A foreboding plot if I've ever seen one. However, our plot begins here, in this blanket fort. Here is where Frey sets the overarching metaphor of the game.
Put your hand on the curtain. I do it too, on my side. Do you feel the hand or the curtain?
Martin's vice is one that many can understand even if we can't see it. Emotional barriers. Martin is a person who struggles to trust, a person who takes comfort in the walls he's set around himself. They protect him from the hurt and pain of losing someone emotionally important, but at the cost of closeness. Martin wants that emotional connection, and the space between explores that desire very closely. Martin responds that he feels both.
I don't see you, but I know you're there behind.
Behind the blanket he feels his friend, a person so close, yet so distant. It is worth asking what is the root cause of distrust. What happened to Martin that made him the way he is? Trust itself is a fickle thing. It's a bond that keeps our relationships strong, but it can so easily be broken. Distrust comes from a place of failure, when you expect something in a person only for them to disappoint you in an exceeding fashion. In worst cases, it comes from a place of betrayal, when you put your confidence into someone only for them to hurt you painfully. In reality, it's unclear what happened to Martin to cause him to create emotional barriers around him, but there is a dichotomy between his desire for closeness and his trust in distance that eats away at him. Belgian psychotherapist Esther Perel once said, "Love rests on two pillars, surrender and autonomy." Our need for togetherness exists alongside our need for separateness. One does not exist without the other. This duality is what's at the heart of the space between, and its cause is her. Clara's presence in the story is quite significant. She is invasive and questioning when Martin would be seclusive. As the player, we get all of our information from Clara, as she gets Martin to open up and questions various aspects of him. To Martin, she's also a rapport, someone he takes comfort in and desires. Frey spends a lot of time building the relationship between these two, and through them we see different sides of Martin's seclusiveness. When Martin first meets Clara, it is outside his apartment complex, where they converse and observe residents from their windows. This serves as a metaphor for Martin. He peers into the lives of others through the safety of his emotional distance, reflecting a desire for significance in another's life, but a strong sense of distrust that holds him back. This perfectly reflects his feelings on Clara too. In the vapidness of his emotions, she is there to bring color, and by the climax of the relationship, she brings warmth. But to get there, we must first lay the foundation, and where better to do so than the very theatre Martin was commissioned for? The theatre plays many roles in the narrative of the space between. It's a physical space for the player to traverse and take in. It's also an allegory for different aspects of Martin. Take the size of the theatre itself. When we first see the building, we see this grandiose structure of concrete that takes away a good chunk of our screen, leaving us with an image that cements itself in our mind. Now take a look at the surroundings. Notice the dull color palette and the lack of any direct sunlight. We could chalk it up to obvious factors, i.e. how the game is rendered, the field of view, the lack of a detailed skybox. But what I see here is a metaphor. The theatre itself is a manifestation of Martin's emotional barrier, and it's a barrier so large, so overwhelming, that it blocks out the warmth and radiance of a potential lover. Just as the building plays a role in the space between, so does architecture. It's a profession that very much fits Martin. In the previous scene, Clara asks about our protagonist's job.
I'm an architect.
You're a builder of walls.
Sometimes walls don't have to be out of matter.
This is Frey being on the nose about the overarching theme of the space between, which we've already established. What's more interesting is how architecture plays into the theme of art and the egoism that comes with it. There is a strong tie between the emotional barriers set by Martin and the egoism built from his creations.
It is hard not to identify with your work, right?
More often than not. And it is hard to let go. But that's why I am an architect. I don't have to let go. I can live inside my work.
He figuratively and literally lives inside his work. He has his own room inside the theatre.
You built a room for your ego so it can live here, didn't you?
You may wonder how egoism relates to the creation of emotional barriers. The term egoism refers to the emphasis of self-interest as the motivator for all conscious actions. Ego is built out of insecurity. A person may be conditioned to expect a certain outcome, and should it warp that person's perception of reality, it triggers an ego where any other vision of that reality is false. Martin may have been conditioned into distrusting the closeness of others, and thus he let an ego brew from the buildings he's created, seeing the value in that above all else. These observations, among other things, shows how much depth there is to the narrative, especially for how short of a game it actually is. A playthrough of the space between will only last you an hour at most, and that time is spent so thoroughly building up its characters, making the player really sense progression as these two individuals grow fonder of each other. It feels deliberately slow in a way that emphasizes the mood of the entire piece, and what's brilliant is that it never feels like it wastes your time. Everything is just so meaningful. The gameplay of the space between also showcases a sharp focus on time and spacing. The game has no traditional gameplay. Its lack of mechanical depth serves to bolden the atmosphere of the game. It allows you to walk at your own pace, feel the environment, and alleviate any distractions so that you can fully take in what you experience. The method in which the space between delivers its story is cryptic. Lines of dialogue are drawn out and unlabeled, leaving no indication of who's speaking and no way to mingle with the pace of the narrative. This is a stylistic choice that reflects its Arthouse inspiration. It again highlights the importance of time and space, reflecting the droning nature of isolation and the desire for closeness. The space between as a whole is very open-ended, but it's never aimless. Frey shows that he understands the delicacy of his story and knows how to keep it in balance to reiterate the themes of the game, and I have to say he does a superb job at keeping you curious all the way into its final act. So far we haven't discussed the horror side of the space between. You could say there's been a scarcity in spooks, but no matter, because Frey delivers on the horror superbly. All the time spent building up to this moment finally pays off, and it starts with the snipping of scissors. Martin finds himself in a maze full of blankets. These walls that once protected him now suddenly confuse him. He's lost in his own maze of emotions, and then you find the silhouette of a woman behind a peculiar blanket with two holes cut behind them. The imagery represents Clara and how she broke into Martin's barriers, with her words and her intimacy. the final act evokes what the previous ones have been building up towards. The slow walk speed and the lack of vision help to make the player feel dread. The panic in Martin's words as he's scrambling to find Clara, scrambling to find warmth. It's quite the peak for a game like this, a game that spent so much of its pacing on build-up. It's a very neat inverse of the components established throughout the game. The lo-fi aesthetic that added to the prestigious tone of the theatre is now used to embolden the darkness of the understage. The grandiose arrangement of the music is now shrouded in noise and ambience that unnerves. The narrative that tried to open Martin up suddenly implodes and reiterates the isolation he's put himself in. When I think of Arthouse Horror in video games, I immediately think of the space between. Not too often do I see a game with such a sharp focus on its themes and delivered in a way that's compelling to both play and talk about. It's a game that may not be to everyone's liking, but there's no denying the fruit this surrealist experience bears in terms of artistically expressive horror games. It's only fitting that we wrap up the surrealness and talk about a game that's equally out there in terms of its experimentations with game formulas. Paratopic is one hell of a ride in many ways, and is a game that's not afraid to get weird with its experimentations. Developed by Arbitrary Metric, Paratopic is both inspired and inspiring, taking overt elements from film and creating something unique that no other horror game does. Its various aspects and open-ended narrative makes it tough to pin down what it's really about, but at the same time, who cares? Paratopic seemingly doesn't. It's Arthouse in how it takes conventional game tropes and fucks with them in whatever way it sees fit. But before we jump the gun, let's first explore exactly what this game is. Paratopic is a story told asynchronously through 3 different perspectives. One of them is a driver, another is an assassin, and the final is a birdwatcher. At the core of these 3 characters, there's an ominous entity. This symbol is used to represent them. How they affect the different perspectives isn't the most clear, but it is the glue that ties them together. For the driver and the assassin, this entity is presented in the physical space as illicit videotapes. The driver's role is to smuggle these tapes over a nondescript border, while the assassin's is to eliminate one of the dealers to retrieve them. The birdwatcher doesn't have a physical object. They instead stumble across an underground bunker pertaining to this entity, where you find TV screens playing ominous footage, presumably meant for workers of this facility. These elements of Paratopic's storytelling are very much inspired by how Pulp Fiction does it. The use of multiple characters that abruptly transition from person to person creates a narrative that's fragmented but cohesive. The videotapes are also a MacGuffin similar to the briefcase. We don't ever get to see its contents, but we can infer its effects just by how the characters react to them. These elements aren't used for the sake of ripping off. They serve a purpose that helps with the horror of Paratopic.
We happy? Yeah, we happy.
Arguably what makes Paratopic's horror work so well is its surrealness and how it comes from mundanity. The surreal elements are a nod to David Lynch, and how it achieves that through its aesthetic is excellent. On the surface it can nonchalantly be dismissed as retro PSX graphics, but it's not used for evoking nostalgia, but for its texture. Low poly visuals are flexible, and are shaped to really emphasize the surrealness of Paratopic. What we are left with are uninviting impressions of reality that play with our imagination. Are my eyes playing tricks on me, or is that an actual person? Surrealness isn't just from visuals alone, sound also plays a big part. The voice acting in particular stands out because it's not exactly coherent. There may be some proper words here and there, but it's mixed in with nonsensical gibberish. The result is rather fitting. Conversations have a structural flow to them that make them feel legitimate, but the incoherency makes them feel surreal. Altogether, Paratopic presents a visual and an auditory aesthetic that's almost eldritch, but believable. At first glance, it might be puzzling to see how you combine Pulp Fiction and David Lynch, but Paratopic shows there is a lot of interplay between the two styles. The broken narrative can create a feeling of disjointment and uncertainty, and combined with the mundane environments, it creates a mood that's foreign to us. It frames the story of Paratopic as a sort of recollection of memories, making things hazy, and with the impressions of reality through the low-poly visuals and unique vocal delivery, everything just feels alien. It's wonderful how well it works, and it's essential that it does, because it's the foundation in which Paratopic's various themes and experimentations are done. Paratopic is a collage of different ideas. There's elements of body horror, cultish iconography, conspiratorial themes, thrilling action, and quiet drives. Its experimentations varies wildly, but its most successful are its pacing and its gameplay. Typically, horror game stories are linear. They are roller coasters in that they are fixed experiences. All the twists and turns happen when a developer deems fit to do so, maintaining a fixed pace that pushes its player along. Paratopic's narrative pacing isn't linear, and that goes very well into making the game's tones and moods feel even stronger. But what makes it more interesting is how it ties its pacing into its gameplay in a very clever way, and the two examples that showcase this best are the smuggler's perspective and the assassin's. The smuggler's side of the story is spent mostly unbroken. Minutes are spent driving long stretches of road, letting the world outside envelop you. As you continue to drive, the world around you slowly fades away into darkness. The radio broadcast you used to ease the silence of a long drive slowly gets lost to static. It's an effective form of tone building that champions subtlety, but before the game lets you get too comfortable, we're pulled away to another perspective. The assassin's story beats act as a punctuation mark in Paratopic. They are sections where tensions are at their peak, but where we experience them feels jarring. When we first meet the assassin, it is at the peak of their narrative. We load 6 shots in a revolver, ready ourselves, bust in, and be greeted with a title card. Where other games would build up to this moment, Paratopic instead chooses to show it early, telling the player upfront that their expectations won't receive any payoff. It's only after a certain amount of time where we return to this scene to get the release of tension, but by then it's lost its potency. Now instead of feeling cool, we feel awkward. We as a player are just thrusted into this situation, seemingly out of nowhere. But in your hands is the gun, and its barrel faces a panicked man. The instincts kick in. Just like that, it's over. You are robbed of any form of satisfaction. When you inspect the table and see the tapes, you pick one up and shove it into the VHS player, but instead of seeing its contents, you're brought back to the moment you killed the man. Twice. It's a subtle effect, but it reinforces your actions, making you confront the violence you caused. The pacing is all over the place, and it feels jarring on the player, never being allowed to feel comfort for even a second. What this section highlights is Paratopic's utilization of gameplay mechanics to reiterate its mood. The assassin's perspective uses FPS mechanics to reinforce our nature to cause violence. In a traditional FPS, your efforts are often commemorated and cherished, but in Paratopic you're almost scolded. You're held back from progressing, even if it's only for a moment, but it's just enough to bring the kill back to your attention. In the smuggler's perspective, the use of driving reiterates the silent terror of a long drive. Even with the use of a radio to ease tensions, you never quite feel like you're safe. As you leave the city behind, that feeling is only highlighted. These various elements are ultimately what makes Paratopic interesting. It's an example of Arthouse that very much loves the media that inspires it, but also takes the tropes set by horror games and experiments with them in a way that fits the game best. While it's rough around the edges, Paratopic is a very worthwhile game that's a treat to those who enjoy experimentation. However, I have saved the best for last, and the next game I want to discuss is by far the most experimental of the bunch, in the best way possible. In terms of games that truly translate Arthouse Horror into the medium, few are as excellent as Anatomy. Developed by Kitty Horror Show, Anatomy is a game built on one simple premise. What if a house was sentient and it despised you? It's a question that's scary to think about, and only gets worse the more you ponder over it. It's a concept that's rife with potential, and Miss Horror Show explores the question excellently. The home is a building of great significance in our lives. It houses and facilitates all of our activities, and we are the most vulnerable in our homes. Anatomy's very first tape addresses why this concept is scary.
In the psychology of the modern civilized human being, it is difficult to overstate the significance of the house. Since as early as the Neolithic era, humankind has defined itself by its buildings. Buildings for worship, buildings for socializing, buildings for protection, even buildings for the commemoration of the dead. But of all the structures that mankind has invented for itself, there is little doubt that the house is that which it relies upon most completely for its continued survival.
The value we put on our houses is insurmountable, but at the end of the day, it is expendable. When a house no longer serves our purpose, it's left behind without a second thought, abandoned. Now consider if this house was sentient. How would it feel about all those times it was damaged? How would it deal with being abandoned? How would you feel if it hated you? The dread and horror that this concept brings out is unnerving, and Miss Horror Show taps into it so well. But at a first glance, you wouldn't think so. Anatomy's first impressions are very deceptive, and it just makes the impact of its horror all the more wonderful. On the surface, it's an unassuming game. Its core loop revolves around exploring a dark house, collecting cassette tapes and delivering them to the kitchen where you listen to their contents. As an elevator pitch, it sounds like a very boring game, but it uses that opening to draw you in. While your peripheral vision is limited, this is unmistakably a house, and you cautiously fall into its comfort. The tapes themselves are interesting enough to keep you curious, but the further you progress in the game, the more twisted it gets. The facade is peeled back, and the game starts glitching and distorting. Fleshy textures appear. An ominous red paints the room. The house is alive, and it's held you hostage. What things can such a hostile place do? Well, one of the tapes tells a story of a person who enraged this house.
I look out through the bedroom window and I see a truck approaching. A young man steps out, approaches, and enters through the front door. His body is covered in swollen ticks the size of quarters. He's walking through the downstairs hallway and laughing. He begins urinating on the wall. He spits on the carpet. He's moving through the first floor, breaking and upsetting things. He goes to the basement and stands at the top of the stairs. I'm angry at him, so I slam the door and he falls down. I can feel his bones snapping. The ticks are bursting, oozing old black blood everywhere. I can feel him being ground up, dissolved and torn, splitting and shredding. I leave the door closed.
A tale like this humanizes the house, makes it feel alive. It makes its hate all the more severe, especially when it's directed at you.
There is an important distinction that must be drawn between the words dissection and vivisection, a distinction that would appear to be lost on you. Your purpose was to listen, and yet at every turn you have pried, you have prodded, and you have interfered. Have you not been paying attention? Did it not occur to you that as an organism existing within a greater organism, your intrusion would be felt? And still you harassed. And now, like the wayward spider who witlessly settles upon a sweeper's tongue, you will be swallowed. Because the truth is this. When a house is both hungry and awake, every room becomes a mouth.
Sentience isn't the only way horror comes to life. Elements of body horror are laced into the game, and really it makes sense. You can't have a game like this without body horror being at the heart of it. There's of course the fleshiness that's introduced in the third act of the game, but there's also the imagery the house instills into our minds. There's other elements that go into making the game that are worth pointing out. Anatomy is very experimental with gameplay, aesthetics, and even more outside of that. For instance, the game is structured into 4 separate acts, but at the end of every act, the game crashes. This further extends the vicious hate the house has for you, almost like it forces you out of its home, and any time you return, you're actively invading its chasms. There's the use of gameplay and how it deceives you. The implementation of scavenger hunting itself isn't experimental, but how it's used. Its initial impressions lulls the player into lowering their tensions. After all, there's nothing scary about grabbing some tapes in a house. But combined with the low view distance and the tone of the game, that tension is never lost. And the further you progress the game, the more each tape feels like a minor victory. Suddenly, traversing these halls to find them is a tense affair in which you dread every step you make. That is in part thanks to the glitchy nature of anatomy. The brokenness of the game is deliberate, and oddly enough, it feels very organic. It adds texture, like you can feel the sharpness of the house's anger, like its rage is so visceral that its insides stop making logical sense. And who could blame such a lonely house for feeling so abandoned? It makes you ask yourself, what happens to a house when it is left alone? When it becomes worn
and aged, when its paint peels and its foundations begin to sink, when it goes for too long unlived in? What does it think of? What does it dream?
All three games are compelling examples of how Arthouse Horror can be presented in video games. But why are they compelling? What about them makes them Arthouse Horror? Well, if we want a literal comparison, one can look back at the characteristics of Arthouse Horror. A reliance on atmosphere building, psychological character development, cinematic style, and philosophical themes as the backbone for scares. And all three games fit the bill, but discussing them this way is just plain boring. What elevates these games beyond typical horror is how they explore the capabilities of horror through this medium. They are not retreads of film, but inspired by them. Even with a game like Paratopic, whose influences are obvious, it's not just a straight mishmash of Lynch and Pulp Fiction. Like how Arthouse Horror film toys with its established tropes, these games toy with established horror game structures to different effects. The space between takes an extreme approach to walking sim style gameplay, putting all the emphasis on taking in your surroundings and the dialogue you read. Paratopic uses traditional mechanics and archetypes to generate tension, with the monster type entity to create uncertainty, and elements such as the use of FPS mechanics to question a player's actions by repetition. Anatomy uses the trope of fetch quest style gameplay to deceive the player's expectations in clever ways. These experimentations with game structures are what make their horror feel so compelling. They help facilitate the themes that each game tackles. The use of long pauses and slow pacing in the space between emphasizes the longing effects of isolation. Its use of time reflects the emptiness a lack of a relationship does, and the build-up to the final act reflects the power of intimacy and closeness. Paratopic's broken narrative and disjointed gameplay pace reflects the surrealist manner in which the game tackles its themes. Anatomy's use of the house, body horror, and deliberate jank reflect the bitterness of this house. It reflects its personification and creates a strong sense of discomfort in an establishment we take for granted as safe. All three games show just what creativity sprouts in the indie horror scene, showing how much potential there is in Arthouse horror games, but it begs the question, will there ever be more horror games like this? Definitely. There will always be people out there producing really creative games, and horror is no exception. While not every game will be considered Arthouse, there will always be something of artistic merit worth pointing out. It's just a matter of finding it.